Hello, everyone, and welcome to a slightly different version of Bible and Archaeology Live. Happy to see you. Bob is in a meeting, so your quick disclaimer, hey, happy to see you. Bob is going to be back next week, so you're going to get 2 lives this month because of a little cross-scheduling. So you've got me today, you'll have me and Bob next Friday, and to immediately get to that point, Constellation Pegasus, yes, I did get your email with the commentaries on Cyrus, and I have that in the agenda to talk about with Bob next week because, it's fun and it's interesting. Thank you for sending that along. Always appreciate the deep dives that you do and the stuff that you can send in. So the spoiler, the early look ahead for people who are like, what are you talking about? Constellation Pegasus sent over some commentaries talking about Cyrus in the way that they're dealing with traditions and what might be happening there. So we will... Bob and I will be discussing that next week because that is one of those very, very fun things to unpack in the way these different people come in over time because it is odd. And instead of being the hero, getting moved to the negative in the same way that you have other individuals who get flipped from being such a negative portrayal into being almost heroic because of stuff you need them to be later. Or maybe they are villainized in different ways. And in here, I'm also thinking about our conversation with Dr. Adam Silverstein from earlier in this month on his book on Haman and how Haman slides into different categories for different people. Almost always the villain, right? He is the villain in all those retellings, but to what extent, to what degree, and against what people that allow him to be such different things that these characters like a Cyrus, like a Nebuchadnezzar, allow different communities on, and in ways that sometimes they need like apologetics to say, well, maybe he is as bad as we thought, maybe he is worse than we thought, maybe he's not as bad as we thought, and depending on your time period, it can slide around. So yes, we will be unpacking that next week with Bob, but thank you for the reminder because I think I sent it to him. I can't remember if I have just started working on this and if it was going to be a surprise for him. So I will cycle back with Bob on that for next week. But next week, Bible and Archaeology Live 2 here, still at 11 o'clock. That one should be fine. But yes, thank you for your appreciation. Schedules happen as school calendars go along. Schedules can get muddy and confusing and messy. So happy to have, yes, from hero to zero, just like that. I want to cycle to a couple questions that we got coming in from some videos and from some emails, and then I'm going to jump in K-Foss, to your question about elephantine papyrus here. So a comment question that we got on the video Bob and I did this week on Genesis 38 and Judges 11, discussing some of the things within that text, those texts. A question about was Levirate marriage part of the patriarchal age? Their question coming in because, right, that comes to us from Deuteronomy. And so if we're working in a text in Genesis, in the patriarchal age, set there, should we be seeing anything having this concept, the levirate marriage idea there? Is that fair or is that unfair? If we say, Moses composed Deuteronomy, Moses doesn't compose Deuteronomy, right? But in the world of the text, is it attributed to Moses, coming from Moses, or is it even later? If it's coming from Josiah, how will we be dealing with this? So I think the first thing I want to say is, if we turn to the text itself, if we just look at Genesis 38 for a potential answer, Genesis 38:8 gives us something there, which is that go perform the duty of a brother-in-law. So there we have something in the confines of the text that is not explicitly saying, right, the whole explanation of what levirate marriage is, but is putting forward this framework to say, hey, once that brother dies, the text says this is happening. Now you have to ask the question, is that a fair remembrance of whatever Judah might have been saying? Or is that something that's put into the text in light of knowledge of later materials from Deuteronomy that fit the narrative? And so could this have been a story that existed pre-levirate marriage systems that then aligns with levirate marriage? And so maybe it doesn't have that full system, but it aligned, and so it got added in. Or does the codification of levirate marriage in Deuteronomy reflect an older, long-standing tradition within the community that says, out of care for individuals, and I'm using care there in the way that the Hebrew Bible would be talking about care, that we do this thing. And so when we see it happening in Deuteronomy, is that reflecting something that already existed? This is a similar kind of question that you can ask about some of the festivals. When we see festivals being inaugurated in the text, as we're going through in the bonus podcast, dealing with Exodus, when we have these things coming in around like Passover or the Festival of Unleavened Bread, are those instances where the text is now preserving textually within a narrative something that had existed before? Or is it creating something brand new out of this moment? Both of those things are positions that people take. Not everyone is going to agree. And it doesn't mean that you have to apply the same across all instances. So would they have known of the text from Deuteronomy? If you take the chronology of the text, no. Does that mean that they couldn't have known? If that's reflecting some tradition, something like that, they could have. That then gets preserved in Deuteronomy. Another option is that someone later imposed that type of system on top of that. So many paths around that type of question, but the types of questions that are really fun to look at, to say, as we pick the text apart, if you look at it from this angle, maybe it says one thing and another. If you like that kind of stuff, hopefully, you enjoy the things we do here, but also I think you would enjoy the bonus podcast if you're interested in those kinds of questions and the unpacking of those types of things. I'm going to come to some more comment questions in a second, but I want to turn to the chat here. Kphos. Did the papyrus found in Elephantine debunk the Bible? No Moses, no mention of laws, no Noah, no Ten Commandments. High priest of Jerusalem, let them have a polytheistic temple. Yes. So the question of what's happening there is interesting in what it knows and what it doesn't know. There's always the question that you have to ask, like, if we don't have it preserved within the papyri that we have, the absence of a reference to Moses or the law, or does that mean that they didn't know about those things, or that what we have preserved lacks those references? So our material remains can be everything that they had. That's a possibility. More likely, it's a percentage. Now, does that mean that our percentage is representative of the whole collection, or is our percentage representative of just a smaller minority and other texts might look somewhat different? I think a comparable thing we could turn to here is the Dead Sea Scrolls. As we talked about, another cross-promotion here from a recent podcast with Dr. Sidney White Crawford, there are categories of texts within the materials that get associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls. And not all of them talk about the same things. And so if you were to think about the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and maybe you're finding just specific texts that don't give reference to other texts, does that mean that community, if you just find the community rule, if that's all that you find and you don't find biblical texts, you could say, oh, it seems like they don't know these things. And then you find those other ones and you go, oh, okay, we do have these things now. So what we're finding there may represent just a portion of what is there. And that's just the way that all of this works and what makes it difficult. However, the dynamics between those communities is another aspect that we can see within the texts, where they are having these conversations, with the priesthood in Jerusalem and the requests going back and forth and what they're doing and what they're allowed to do and how they're doing it, that slightly change the understanding, or that should change, maybe I should say, our understanding of how these communities are related to each other, how solidified practices are, who's allowed to do what, and where, in ways that we can often oversimplify. I think in looking back, we can take the text presentation at face value, that things are so secure, that things are just in Jerusalem. Whether you are looking way, way, way back, whether you're looking here at this period, there's lots of different times that give examples that maybe the text is presenting an oversimplified or cleaned up version. And when you find things like this, that maybe they are representing a broader diversity in the traditions. I think if you're interested in this, there's lots of good work on those. There's also the scholar Gabriele Boccaccini, who writes a lot about Second Temple Judaism and the diversity of opinions and thought that is happening there, that I think you might find interesting. He doesn't go so much into the depths there of just what's happening at Elephantine, but all of the different ways, the methodologies, the approaches, the communities that represent a diversity of pre-exilic, exilic, and post-exilic Judaisms that functioned, that come together, that work with each other, that work away from each other in different ways and different times. And yeah, K. Tempest Bradford, is it fair to say they represent a version of pre-exilic? They might represent one of these communities. I think, though, if we put them as a community in conversation with another community, the Dead Sea Scrolls communities, you can see that, yes, there are communities, a multiplicity of communities that are working around similar ideas with similar bodies of text, with similar traditions and concerns, but do position themselves differently and approach things differently. And what do they prioritize? How do they prioritize it? That will then reflect those types of communities. It's also something we do just see in the Hebrew Bible, where you can turn to different texts and see, okay, how elevated is Moses in this? How elevated is Aaron in this? They're on my mind because we're talking about Exodus right now. But where is Aaron privileged and where is Aaron pushed down? What community, if you turn towards source identification, or if you want to put the text in different hands, how might that reflect those kinds of things? So a very long-winded answer to say they do present something different. I don't know that I'd say they debunk the Bible, but this is a question that I think we should add into the agenda of episodes that we should do to reach out and say, hey, let's do an interview on what's happening down there with those papyri. So thank you for your question. Always looking for topics that you were interested in. So if there are things like that that you want to hear, let me look around. Let me send out some emails and see if we can't get somebody in here. Well, I've got to say, we have a fun couple weeks lined up for you in the podcasts coming your way. We have a good friend who's returning. We have a number of good friends who are returning. We're getting into October, so we're going to do a couple of the things that maybe you expect, some things that maybe you don't expect. Well, so let me reach out and we'll see what we can't get in October or November to talk about what's happening there in Elephantine and what it might mean for those types of relationships. So thank you. That's a great question. That's a very good question. And yes, Aaron is out here getting slandered all the time in the Golden Calf. I am. We have a new visiting assistant professor here at the department who deals with Golden Calf traditions that I am getting scheduled to come on and talk some about this. She does work in Golden Calf stuff, maybe in a way you don't expect, but she's been very busy with the start of the school year. And so in time, we're going to get that in there because the Golden Calf story is really fun. I know we talked about this some with Mark Lucher a couple of months ago. So I think we talked about it as well with Dan McClellan. It's just one of those stories that keeps on giving because it shows up in so many different places within the biblical text, but not always in the same way. Like Exodus 32 is that one that I think most people know, yes, but that we get that tradition showing up in different ways and not always with the same description or representation. So we are going to do a Golden Calf return redux episode here in the future. So keep your eyes out for that as well. I want to turn to a question that we got in our Ask Jordan Anything episode, which I guess this kind of is as well. A question that came in from one of you. Did people in the Hellenistic period believe in their myths? And so this is a great question that I think is really hard to unpack because you can do the quibble on like, well, what do we mean when we say believe? And what do we mean when we say myth? And I don't think those are unfair things to do, to say, well, how are we classifying belief? And how are they classifying belief? Are those the same? When we use the word myth, are we using that negatively? Are we using that as a description of all traditions? What baggage are we bringing in just within those words? Because if we turn towards what we can know from authors, from philosophers, from playwrights in the period, you get a diversity of opinions to answer this question, where some, seem to hold the idea of their mythologies, the ideas of their gods and their heroes in great regard, and hold those things up. That doesn't mean that they're not allowed to make changes over time, introduce new traditions, introduce new characters, new aspects. That happens when you're reading through those traditions as characters and stories grow to reflect new concerns. I don't think that would mean that they don't necessarily believe, because they are continuing to return to that well of tradition to give them something of value, something to say, something that they find helpful. So there, I think you would have an instance where in some of these texts, there seems to be evidence of belief. In what way? Now, does that mean belief in the same way that, like, I believe this pen is in front of me? That might be different. Another category, though, is a no category, that yes, we do have evidence, even before the Hellenistic period, running through the Hellenistic period and into the post-Hellenistic world, of authors, of philosophers, of playwrights who don't believe in that mythology, who do not believe in those gods, and who deride those who do, whether they do this through cynical and mocking plays that take those traditions and rip them apart in front of the eyes of the audience, whether this is from philosophers who say that the gods are too humanized, too anthropomorphized. And so this is where you get things like, if a horse could draw, their god would be a horse. Those types of claims that come from the Greek philosophers like Xenophanes that pick apart those traditions in a way that they say, I don't believe this. Now, there is a distinction to have in there that not all of those who will pick that apart may go so far as to say they think the gods aren't real, or that they think their mythology is not real, but that maybe there is a failure in the way the real divine presence has come across into the understanding of those traditions. That's where a big category of those individuals fall that say there is something there, but we are wrong in our depiction. So there are like the yes, there are the no's, and there are maybe the gray areas as well. So from the written traditions, we have that. I think we should also say we have to ask a question of, like, for the regular individual, how do we know? How do we know what they might believe? Something we can turn to is, the archaeological evidence. What is that telling us? It's telling us that there are a lot of temples around, that there are dedicatory offerings being made, that there are pilgrimages and travels between those, that there are real priestly systems existing there to support it, that there are offerings that are made to those. Those things do exist. And so how you want to categorize that type of belief versus practice can be something you debate, but there is real practice there. There is a real world of archaeological evidence that shows the existence of those spaces, dedicated persons for those spaces, and ongoing ritual practice at those spaces, which would be hard to exist if there's not a system of belief behind it. What do they believe? How do they believe in it? That can vary for every individual. What does that individual mean? So, do they believe in them? It would depend on who you ask, but that there are individuals who did believe in those traditions, in those myths, and those gods. There's those who didn't, and there's those who might fall in between. So a long, again, winded answer to say yes, no, and maybe so, and a little bit of something everywhere in between. But I think this is one of those types of questions that we can be maybe too cynical on at times and saying, well, they have these traditions. How could they? There's no way they really believe in these kinds of things. And you can find voices that would support that, but you'll also find voices to the contrary and evidence of practice to the contrary. So not all of them may fall into belief in the way that you think, but that, there's a little bit of something there. So thank you for your question there on that one. If you have other questions that you would like to see, do a little bit of background on for those kind of Ask Us Anythings, we're happy to do those. Those were just Mary Kate's questions that she'd had because we talk through things all the time. And she just has, I think she said this in that video too, like a running list of, here are the questions that come up that I just hold on to in the hopes that we cycle back to around later. So that was the start there. If you have questions like that, whether they come up here in a live or whether they happen there, send them along. You can leave them in the comments here. You can send us an email. If you find text like Constellation Pegasus did and you want to send us pictures from those pages to say what's happening here, I love getting those emails too. So that email is Bible-Archaeology@uiowa.edu. It's linked down in the description. It's in our link tree. There's lots of ways to be in touch. We'd love to hear from you. So hopefully, if you got questions, you can send them our way. I'd say the same thing goes if you're finding those kinds of odd archaeological videos that exist. Those have been a fun thing to unpack. So if you have some of those, send them our way as well. Happy to walk through those, whether they be long or short, to see what people have to say. And yes, Constellation Pegasus, you're there. Didn't Aaron have the weakest excuse in human history? All I did was put the gold in the fire and out came the calf. Yeah, so I was just reading through this because who doesn't love reading a little bit of Exodus 32? And I was reading through this because I was reading an article by Elizabeth Van Dyke, who is the new VAP here that does stuff with golden calf traditions. And yeah, the way that Aaron functions in the Exodus 32 tradition, she has an interesting article. I can link it down below Let me make sure I do that. Link article. As a way that this describes, the text could be seen to describe a different type of manufacture process than maybe what we know. But yeah, Aaron's excuse that I put it in and it popped out is just such a fun, odd response to say, like, I didn't do it. This feels like, in a one way, you're saying that this must have been divinely made, right? That's a reading you could have of this from Aaron's position, saying, hey, I threw it in, and this is the thing that came back out. So it wasn't crafted, we didn't make it. But there are different ways that you could read that text to say, did he participate in any of this, or did he craft it? Because like verse 24, Exodus 32:24. So I said to them, the I being Aaron, whoever has gold, take it off. So they gave it to me. I threw it into the fire, and it came out, this calf, which is, a real weak excuse and reading there. Aaron like passing the buck to the fire. I didn't do it, the fire did it. But an interesting way that Dr. Van Dyke goes through this, that maybe there's some more evidence of crafting that comes into this story than we might expect. But here in Exodus 32, you do get an interesting negative portrayal right here of Aaron in the world of priests. I love the world of priests. But that the connection that we have between like the Levites and Aaron and all the priestly system, as we talked about with Dr. Lucher, you can go and see that interview, is more complex than we might see at surface level on some of these things. And so here within Exodus 32, a common argument is that there is, on the one hand, a negative polemic being made against the northern traditions that have these golden calf stories. And so here you have Moses deriding this practice and an explicit condemnation of it, the destruction of it, and then what you get as sacred violence with the Levites. There's that level exists. You also then have a layer that is an anti-Aaron story, very possibly within this, that portrays Aaron negatively, given his participation in this practice in a way that then is rebuked by Moses. And as a part of the fix for this, you have the Levites. So an origin story for the Levites here being that elect group that chose the right side, that stood up and performs here what is a mass slaughter, but gets described in a sacred performative way that can help correct the community. And so a story for the Levites that works one way, a story for Aaron and the descendants of Aaron, the Aaronites, that works a different way, the story for Moses that is slightly different, a story that is against the north or for the south, all of these different layers and traditions that exist within this narrative, that if you just see, for me, I don't know, this feels like one of those things that is so easily like veggie-tailed in my mind, given my veggie-tail upbringings, that you can see that first version that you had, which is just the negative, we're going to make fun of Aaron because it popped out of the fire, which is certainly there, but also miss these other layers that exist within it that show all the different hands and community concerns that are coming through in this text and who it can speak to and how over time. So an interesting thing in Exodus 32. Los Angeles Sports Archive, what are your thoughts on similarities between Jesus' miracles and Elisha's miracles? Yes. So we do certainly have some parallels. In our bonus episodes, we're going through Mark right now. And I want to say it's the one we recorded this week in Mark. We were talking about Jesus and, in the Talitha Cumen, the rising of Jairus' daughter, and parallels that exist between these types of things. In the raising of dead children that we get with Elijah and with Elisha, you also have these types of parallels that exist in the creation of food. In the feeding of the 5,000 is a parallel to a bread production, a food production story. Here, different because you're going to have a crowd versus for an individual. But you do get the return to these types of stories and traditions. And specifically within this text in Mark, let me just pull it up because we were just talking about this one. And so the longer version of this story is going to be in that episode if you find this interesting. I think it's the one that comes out next week because we're dealing with Mark 6 when we go through this, which for the context of my thinking on it right now, I'm thinking about Mark's account of this narrative, which we get after the death of John the Baptist, and we're going to have the feeding of 5,000. We get Jesus walking on water. What am I looking for? In the context of this, I want to say, where am I looking? If I could remember what I wanted to say, this would make it a lot easier. But we have in Mark here the connection, I would say, not just to Elisha, but also to Elijah that we should be thinking about in Mark's description of this, when you have this discussion of John the Baptist, that is John the Baptist the return of Elijah, and then the continuation of that with the concern of Jesus. And if Elijah is doing these types of stories before, doing these types of miracles, doing these types of acts, is that something that you should be seeing, that Mark is putting forward for you to see in these types of moments where you have a type of activity that carries on in some way, showing, oh, look, there's a prophetic concern in these materials. And in other ways, that's saying, hey, we have a continuation of that type of prophetic action happening between the miracles that get ascribed to Jesus and that get ascribed to Elisha and to Elijah. Another thing to add within that is that what is miracle and what is magic conversation, that I'm going to be talking with Peter Miller here next week, an episode that'll come out this month, about some of this distinction, something we've talked about before, but you have these traditions that miracles that are ascribed to Jesus, sometimes if you were to change a name or you put it into a different text, they will get called, right, magic or these wonderful acts. It's something that Tom Schmidt talked about in his Josephus reading, that some of these mighty deeds, regardless of where you want to go with his reading of, do you think that really comes from Josephus or not? That there is something in it to say you should be seeing, I think, you should be seeing some similarities there. The questions then emerge of, well, why are they doing it? How much are they trying to foreground that for you? Is that stuff we're imposing? If we don't see it, are we missing out on anything? Are the different gospels doing it differently for different purposes? Are they pushing that type of thing fairly? All of those are other questions that open up then. But I think you should, see some similarities there, whether it's in the type of action or in very specific actions themselves. A dangerous question to ask. Tempted to ask for your thoughts on the book, The Crucifixion by an Eyewitness. I've got to say, I haven't read it, so I don't have any thoughts because I haven't seen it. I'm wondering if it is a book that I should look at. My guess, given the skepticism that you posed in your question, is no. But I don't know. I have not read this book, and not sure there. Not sure on that one. I want to return one last time here to, if you have any other questions, throw them in the chat. I'm happy to turn to any of those types of things as we go. Okay, no, don't spend the time that I won't. That's what I was thinking based on the way you phrased that. So happy to have that out of the way right now. That must be why it's never come across any of those reading lists for me. In returning one more time to our Genesis 38, Judges 11 conversation, just because that one came out this week, and it's one of those types of texts that in the comments, let's say, there's some conversation happening around some of those readings because the types of stories that they are and the readings that usually get leveraged onto those texts to say, hey, we should feel one way or another about these traditions because they are extremely uncomfortable in a whole variety of ways and introduce lots of difficulties in an increasing variety of ways. We had one very long comment that I'm not going to go all the way through, but that put forward a couple of things that asked questions of some of the interpretations that we put forward. And I just want to say, like, we're always happy. If you don't like our reading, that's absolutely fine. Please let us know. If you have alternate readings, if you've heard of another thing, put them down there. Our hope is that we're here to present to you, here's a reading maybe you've heard before. Here's a reading maybe you haven't heard before. Here's a disputed reading. Here's another ancient reading. Put all those things on the table to say, this is what's happening around this text, especially in instances like this, where you have in Genesis 38 and in Judges 11, two narratives, two stories that have presented serious problems for communities ever since they emerged, whenever that was. Whenever you want that to be, you cannot deny that interpreters and commenters for the text's history have looked at those texts and identified problems and then sought to apply solutions to fix those problems. Problems like, why is God striking down some of these individuals in Genesis 38? Is it okay that Judah is the one who might be doing this with Tamar? It's not. What is the danger that is presented for Tamar? How does the text feel about what she did or what she didn't do? How is it classifying her? Why might it be put into the middle of the Joseph narrative? Is it to juxtapose these things together? Or is it just to tell us a sidebar of something that's happening while all these things are happening to Joseph? In Judges 11, similar questions. How does this fit into the authors, the compilers, the redactors of Judges attempt to frame the decline, the spin that happens before the period of the monarchy. Did these narratives happen in the sequence that we get them? Did they happen at all? Are the judges real leaders? Are the judges just ideas of these warlords that get brought forward? Are they leading broad areas? Are they just put in specific contexts? How much of a concern does it have for the rest of the text or not? How distinct is Judges from the other texts? There's lots of things that come in on top of then, well, is Jephthah allowed to make this kind of vow? What exactly does his vow mean? What does it mean when at the end of the text we don't get an explicit and he put her down and he raised a knife and he killed her? Does that mean that he didn't? The text is uncomfortable addressing that part. That's where those interpreters can come in to say, well, there's a long-standing tradition that the interpretation is, yeah, he did really sacrifice her. And then where do they go from there? So there's some commenting happening in that one. Happy to let commenting happening in that one. If you have other readings, other questions from those types of texts, or I would say other similar texts that you have come across, because there's a lot of those types of stories. Maybe not always quite to that level, but those narratives that get skipped over, or the narratives that maybe you're like, I've only ever heard this reading of it, but it doesn't quite seem to fit some of the questions that I have of the text. As always, let us know. We're happy to hear questions, to be able to address those kinds of stories, because there's a variety of those stories that exist throughout the text that we can come to. But as we do those, our attempt is never to bring eisegesis, to read things into the text. Instead, to pore over the text slowly and say what might be coming out when we pause, when we look at the words, when we look at the context, when we put this text in conversations with other texts to say what's going on here. The apologetics arguments are different things. Yes, I see. Yeah, a burnt offering is a burnt offering. No way for apologists to scoot around it. This is one of those things where when you come to this text, depending on what you need it to be doing or what it cannot be doing, then there have to be ways that take a term like olah, burnt offering. If you look it up in the context of the Hebrew Bible, use a great tool like Accordance. Put it in, search for it, and look through all the lists. It is a burnt offering. Now, as a verb, yes, getting into the weeds here on the language, as a verb, it can mean to go up, which is how we get it then in its noun form as this burnt offering, the thing that goes up. And so when Jephthah says he verbs that cause to go up, a noun form, the burnt offering. He causes a burnt offering to go up when it's describing what he does to his daughter. He causes her to go up as a burnt offering. It's not that, well, he lets her go into the hills. And so that is the solution. And an argument that you might see in this is it's like Samuel being dedicated. This is not the same as Samuel being dedicated, because there he is dedicated to the temple. He does not return home. That is where he goes. Here it's Jephthah making a vow that the text allows him to make, that he then performs by saying he causes her to go up. His vow is fulfilled. He does what he vowed. The text says that. She goes to the hills, yes. She returns, and then this happens. So it is simply what the text says it to be. And the difficulties, the discomforts, the attempts of interpreters, ancient and modern, to grapple with this are the result of what the text says. When you're looking at the end of Judges 11, let me just pull it up here again. If we're looking at the end of Judges 11, I want to say we're like verse 32, verse 31. And it shall be to me, right? He says, I will be offered up by me as a burnt offering, right? So as an olah, as a burnt offering, that's what it's going to be. And so when he goes home and that happens, verse 39, he did with her according to the vow he had made. No, this is fair, and we say this in the video. It doesn't say that he takes a knife or that he kills her or that he burns her. It doesn't walk through that. This is fair. It does not. But it does say that he does according to his vow, and it said what his vow was. So it comes to that point. And it is understood through ancient translations, ancient commentaries, and interpretations to have confirmed that. So, yeah, he does that. It is there. It's there. There are ways you can try to wrestle around it, interpret out of it, but those all emerge from its existence in Judges 11. So if you have other questions on those texts or on texts like it, send them our way. We're happy to walk through those kinds of things. It's something that, whether the text is happy or sad, joyful or painful, deserve to be wrestled with because they have been preserved in those texts, and so they are to be wrestled with. But for this week, I think I'm going to leave this one here. Thank you, everybody who came along. Happy to see you. And as I said at the opening, I'll say here again at the end, we will have another live next week. Bob and I will be here together. We are going to be going through some comments that have been sent in, some questions that have been sent in. If you are watching this one on replay because you couldn't make it this week and you're like, I can't make it next week live either, email us a question. Join us on Patreon. If you join on Patreon and you send a question in for a live, you are guaranteed that is going to make it into the show. If you email us a question, if we can get to it, I'll bring it in. If you send a question in via comments or something, if we have time, we'll make sure to bring it in. If you're here live and you're watching and you throw a question in, I'm happy to jump to some of them. If they're paid questions, we'll get to those too. But for this week, again, thank you everybody for tuning in. Happy to see you. Always happy to have you along. Thank you so much for watching, for your support. We really enjoy doing this kind of stuff, and hopefully it's things you like as well. But for this week, for this month, good September, I think. Lots of fun things coming in October. Lots of fun interviews and episodes coming your way in October. I will say a thing before we go. Always, as always, remember, if there are interviews you'd like, if there's guests you want us to get or get back, if there's topics you'd like us to circle back to or touch for the first time, let us know. I kind of find this in a way of like, what are the things I want to talk about? And that's kind of what we're scheduling out. If there's things you'd like us to hit, let us know, because if you're interested, the odds are I'm going to be too, and we can find somebody to circle back to. So like from this week, I'm going to follow up on getting something in about what's happening down there in Elephantine. And if there's other things like that that you would like to come in, let us know. But for all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, thank you so much for your support. Until next time.